Great, so we're live, and thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the first panel discussion with Heroes of STEM about the innovations in healthcare and emerging economies. We're doing this together with Science Mission LLC over in the USA. And I'd like to begin by introducing a little bit about the Heroes of STEM community. Now, this is essentially a community of professionals from science, technology, engineering, and maths backgrounds. And we're looking to address three key objectives. The first being improving interdisciplinary communication and collaborations. The second is to improve access and visibility of STEM ventures, initiatives, and also individuals who are looking to build better mentor-mentee associations across different geographies, and also to improve the provision and support of skill-based training for a lot of people who maybe are from less privileged or less advantaged backgrounds. The final aspect of what we're trying to achieve is start discussions about universally accepted and important challenges, particularly such as healthcare, which is why we're having this discussion today, in order to start creating more of a framework for possible change. And all of this aligns with our motto, which is purposeful impact. So with that information at hand, I'd like to begin by introducing our panel. We have to begin with, we have Dr. Kaustubh Dhargalkar from Mumbai, who is someone with who wears multiple hats. He has been in the past an entrepreneur, a consultant, an academic, and currently acts as mentor at a Center for Innovation at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. Besides this, of course, Kaustubh is a contributor and writer to Knowledge at Wharton. He is also an academic who has mentored a number of healthcare startups in India in particular, and in his spare time, I believe he practices and teaches yoga as well. Is that right, Kaustubh?
Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. We have Dr. Sudha Rao, who I've had the pleasure of meeting quite recently as well, who has the incredible foresight and expertise that we really need in a country like India, from the genomics background and the multiomics background even. She's the co-founder and executive director of Genotypic Technologies in Bangalore, and currently also the founder at Omics, which is very diagnostically oriented. If there's something you'd like to add to that, Sudha, please feel welcome to.
Yes, I think given that we were perhaps one of the first companies in India to do genomics, it was almost
unheard of.
Important in the clinical space. So that's what the endeavors to bring in the cutting edge genomics into clinical diagnostics. Speak about it more, as we progress into the discussions on how we've innovated on this.
Excellent. So we're excited to have your views on the discussion as well. And finally, we have Dr. Nicholas Seneca, I should say, from Zurich in Switzerland. Nick, I've also known during his time as a director and head of AstraZeneca Translational Science Group, where he worked closely together with Karolinska Institute. And he has a lot of expertise in the strategy and product design and planning when it comes to pharmaceuticals. And essentially, through his experience through Roche and AstraZeneca, he has insights coming more from the giants from the industry of that nature. Currently, Nick is the director and chief scientist at PMOD Technology, and the focus there is medical imaging and neuroimaging. Is something you'd like to add to that, Nick?
No, thank you very much for the introductions. Look forward to contributing today.
Thank you very much. So, and I am Dr. Kirti Kaul. I'm essentially a molecular biologist with an expertise in diabetes and diabetic complications, and it is an absolute honor and privilege to be able to have a discussion with these three experts and panelists today. So I'd like to begin with a very basic question, first off with Dr. Dhargalkar. I should also point out that we have the possibility of addressing questions towards the end of the session. So please feel welcome to either include them as comments or in the IM. This is for viewers. And Dr. Dhargalkar, if you could just begin by telling us, what is your understanding? How would you go about defining an emerging economy? So we can really start for viewers and the benefits of viewers who don't necessarily understand the economy side of it as much.
Emerging economies, by the term itself, are growing economies. somewhere in that middle phase between an undeveloped economy and a stable economy. Typically characterized by low industrial penetration, more agrarian kind of an economy, lower per capita incomes, maybe a little lower education levels, lower penetration of banking services, but growing fast. The rate of the growth of GDP being higher than the stable economies, obviously because the base is smaller for the GDP calculation. These economies are kind of leapfrogging the development trajectory which the developed economies have gone through. A couple of very cliched examples would be how India jumped over the landline telephone and straight into mobile telephony. Also, we don't have brick and mortar banks in India, but people do mobile banking. So that's the kind of digitization that is happening, and which is taking these emerging economies faster in the growth trajectory. That's how I would define as maybe typically between 3 to 7% kind of a GDP growth would be the typical definition of an emerging economy in today's context.
That's fantastic. This actually brings us to the idea of why is it relevant to talk about healthcare innovations in emerging economies? And I think this is again something that we've only briefly touched on together, Kaustubh, just yesterday. The notion that emerging economies could just be following the exact same model that another existing developed country is already implementing. What do you think might be an argument against this? Why do we need innovations in healthcare systems and possibly a new model in emerging economies?
You want me to take it?
If you like, want to continue.
Or anybody else who wants to take it, please.
Well, actually, I think we're just trying to build the grounds for the relevance as to why is it important to actually have this discussion? Why are we looking to change or even discuss the changes in possible changes in healthcare innovations and models in emerging economies? Now, one example of this, or one way of looking at it, is usually through the eyes of someone like Professor Govindarajan, who mentions that emerging economies are like mega markets with micro consumers. So where in your traditionally stable economies, you might have one individual, one consumer with the capacity to spend $10 US. In emerging economies, you actually have 10 users with the capacity of $1, which has its own challenges, but also it has its own creativity and needs for a very different format, a very different dynamic. And this is something that we would hopefully appreciate through the comments of both Kaustubh and Nick from the more industrial broad setting, and from Sudha from the more technological expertise settings there. So I think from the actual structure of what we should be, I guess what our immediate goals should be. The first person, if I might ask Sudha, in your opinion, what's the most important or promising area, either in terms of technology or modeling systems, which can pose itself as an innovation in healthcare relevant to emerging economies?
So I'll build this on the context of India, because that's where we're coming from. We're about 1/6 the global population. If you see the spend on healthcare, it's paltry compared to even, for example, Brazil, I think, spends more on healthcare than India does. We have considerable challenges. We don't have formal systems. We don't have good regulatory systems in place. Medical aid is not backed up by insurance or government support. So much of innovation has happened from the private sector, and the implementation has been governed through the governmental agencies. If you look at infectious diseases, I think the classic example is, of course, one is, we are very proud that we eliminated polio, right, as a country. The larger challenges like tuberculosis, a big burden in the country, more than 2 million cases. The challenge there is access to healthcare centers and good diagnostics. So a couple of years ago, I think the government implemented a system called Gene Expert in every district hospital in the country, what we realize now is that that's not enough. So access is still an issue. And what that has spurred is a lot of innovation in the point of care diagnostics, where you need little investment into technologies. They're small, they're quick to analyze, and not capital intensive. And that's where a lot of innovation is happening. And from a genetic diagnostic perspective, again, we are a very diverse ethnic population, right? We have so many ethnicities that we know efforts to establish a baseline for our genomic data. So that gives us enormous opportunity to understand it better and personalize treatments. And that's an effort that a few companies in India have started. And Kirti is one of them. And so what this understanding will lead to is, can we use this now for predictive healthcare? Because I did read about the changing demographics. 20 years down the line, the south of India will have, because the growth rate has declined in the south, you will have an aging population with the earning population being less. And you have certain states in the north that will have a younger population that is unemployed. So the burden on healthcare will be significantly high, and you need to be prepared. And I think predictive tests will become important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those comments. Broadly speaking, we believe in typing or a new innovative area.
There's a lot of echo.
Try this way then. So I was just trying to ask that, do you believe
Hello?
Kirti, I'm afraid I could not hear your question clearly.
Yeah, I too could not hear you. And I can hear again an echo.
Do you find a difference in the voice now? Any echo?
Yes, that's a lot better.
Kaustubh, Nick?
Yeah, now you're better. Now it's better.
I still.
I can pick up an echo as well. I'm not sure. As long as we can all hear it, what I was trying to say is, so the belief then that genotyping might be the future. When it comes to innovation in healthcare economies like India. So this is something you're investing in, do you think?
Kirti, I'm afraid I'm not able to get your question clearly. Is that addressed to me or to Kaustubh?
That was actually addressed to you. Said earlier. That genotyping will be the technology for a country like India.
Genotyping will be a very important diagnostic for a growing population. I think Nick here will share. AstraZeneca has, I think, initiated the largest sequencing effort in the world. 1 million of them, Nick?
Yeah.
I forget the actual number, which goes to show the importance of understanding the genetic variations in the human population to aid better diagnostics, more specific. So it is going to be definitely the future for a populous country like ours.
For that. If I can now take the same for Kaustubh, experiences, most promising areas of technologies in order to improve healthcare in India.
What I see, just taking off what Sudha mentioned about remote diagnostics. Centers for diagnostics at maybe not village levels, but at district levels and still lower. What I see coming is a lot of future for cheap wearable devices, which would be probably operated on like a franchisee level, where a locally trained youth or anybody from a village or somebody operates those wearable devices. People come to those kiosks and all that data is captured. If I can share a screen, I would like to show one particular device like this, which came out of MIT's Media Lab, but inspired in India.
Absolutely.
Can I share the screen?
Please go ahead, please.
Yeah. Can you see that? For eye netra.
We don't have your screen so far, no.
No, not yet. I don't know. Sharing the screen and okay, desktop. Can you see it now?
I'm afraid not, Kaustubh.
No. Anyway, it's called eye netra. Maybe people can Google it up. It's a simple plastic box-like thing, and you can attach a smartphone with an eye netra app, and it becomes a diagnostic tool for checking out for an ophthalmologist. Typically, color blindness, the power of the specs, etc. Now that's a device which costs probably something like $50 or $60. That's it. Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of thing that a connected India might be able to capture all this data and can be linked with the Aadhaar card, the UID, Unique Identification Authority of India. All that data can be captured on these kinds of platforms, and that's where the government can really use it very effectively, can make this data available for private companies to really take the execution piece, because the government can't really get into execution at all levels, but it could definitely create the platform. UID today is being talked about as a financial technology, financial fintech innovation. But the way the government of India is going about UID, I think a lot more can be tapped. And that's where the data that Sudha is also talking about could be linked with the Aadhaar card, and it can be really a powerful tool. That's what I see coming up in the future.
Fantastic. That's actually a very fair point. So you're talking in terms of the power of big data in some ways as well, just having multiple data points in order to further get into precision medicine, as was also the comment from Sudha. Unfortunately, we've lost Nick shortly here, whose comment would also be, I think we can come back to. Perhaps in the meantime, in the interest of time, we can move on to the second question, which is to do with so we understand, of course, there's a lot of novel use of diagnostics, as also you've just recently mentioned, Kaustubh. There are a number of new diagnostic strategies these days, ranging from your home genetic testing kits to medical apps, medically oriented apps even. And a lot of it is down to just data acquisition and data crunching. But as a counter-argument to what we often find with countries like India, China, or Brazil, which aren't often knowledge-based, there is a certain degree of skepticism when it comes to data sharing as well. In your mind, while on the other hand, of course, there's a lot of openness to digital medium. So as you were rightly also pointing out, if things are in an app form, they're more likely to be taken up by the consumer. In your mind, what do you think are the chances of novel diagnostics or these disruptive technologies, in a sense, to make it big in countries like India? If I might start this, please, with actually Nick in this instance, if that's okay.
So how to implement them, you mean? Or can I answer the one question about opinion of what are the promising technologies? Can I start with that then?
Go ahead. We lost
and then
it.
how to potentially implement it. Yeah.
Please go
Okay,
ahead.
yeah. So if I can just build on what the others have already said, yeah, I think, yeah, wearables are definitely a good potential way forward. I especially have seen that at Roche, where they, especially in movement disorders, have looked at wearables in Parkinson's disease. Right. As you know, a lot of the endpoints in clinical trials are kind of movement-related or patient-oriented type of outcome measures. So whatever pharma companies can do or whatever physicians can do to track patients, so any type of voice, movement, balance, all these types of things which could be tracked just via an app on your mobile phone. I mean, this is really important, especially in the area of multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease, where looking at changes in movement is really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think Sudha already alluded to the large genomics support from AstraZeneca, and that was from Ruth Marge. She did a great job getting that approved, and it's going to be a very big collaboration. I think for emerging markets and even kind of medicine in hard to reach places, it's very hard to get biopsies of patients. And Roche and AstraZeneca had done a very good job on getting circulating tumor DNA biopsy, so like a liquid biopsy. So any way to confirm a diagnosis in something other than a biopsy that's a little bit easier to get from a patient, of course, is quite a really good advancement in the treatment of patients. And of course, it's not only about circulating tumor DNA, it's also ensuring that the patient has the right mutation, because we don't want to be treating patients that don't, with a drug that won't help them at all. So in terms of if you think about what types of things we need to be able to diagnose a patient, the biopsy is quite challenging. And even the pathology itself is not always 100%. So anything we can do to kind of simplify things. So simplifying a biopsy from a blood sample for a liquid biopsy, I think companies like Astra and others are doing quite a good job on this. If we think about other areas of technology innovation, I mean, I'm not 100% sold on this, but companies like Luminosity, they've done quite a good job of trying to track how good memory training is. So they offer an app to look at memory training. Right. Whether or not this really helps cognitive function long-term, I think that's unknown. But in terms of innovation, technology, potential areas, this is something anyone can use on a daily basis. I think wearables are good. I still, unfortunately, think they're, at least my personal feelings, they're a bit of a fad. And I think you can take wearables and do one way better. I mean, many companies have already tried this or are trying it, and you take wearables and make it a little bit better to ingestibles. So I think we will see a big push in smart pills and sensors and transmitters that people digest. I really think this is the way forward. I mean, wearable is great. I think that'll help build the pathway for ingestibles. I really think this could be a potential way forward. Of course, these could be a bit more expensive, but if you bring down the production cost, they could be more distributed more widely. So,
Definitely. And as you were rightly pointing out as well, this is down to a need. Once the market arises, of course, there will be more of an impetus on bringing down the costs. I think what both Sudha and Kaustubh were trying to allude to is the fact of just having a multiplicity of data, multi-omics, if you will, or formats of, so not just wearables necessarily, but also any other form of technology that does give you access to multiple bits of data in real time from the same individual in order to personalize an outcome or diagnostic. So I think we seem to be on a similar opinion then from part of all our three panelists in this case. But I think you've also already briefly addressed the where you see the novel diagnostics heading in some ways through these ingestibles. Perhaps we can now have Sudha take the question forwards, or rather Kaustubh I see is already also pointing out. So perhaps Kaustubh first.
Just continuing with what he was talking about, some use cases that could arise. Could we discuss that? I mean,
sure, of course, definitely.
I see wearables coming into insurance before they come into diagnostics, mass diagnostics, because insurance today faces problems of determining, they operate on a fixed premium kind of a basis, where the risk could actually not be the same for two different patients. For example, suppose there are two patients, two individuals who want to buy an insurance policy of the same value. Both of them happen to be of the same age. The insurance company administers, the usual diagnostic tests, the blood tests and the ECG, stress test, and all of that. Imagine both of them have the same parameters on that said day. So the insurance premium is fixed to be the same for both the guys. Tomorrow onwards, say the person A is very compliant with therapy. Person B is not compliant with therapy. His sugar levels go up and down, whereas person A, who is compliant, his sugar levels and other health parameters remain well within the band. Now, is it a fair model that an insurance company charges the same premium for both the guys? Obviously not. Today, it operates like this. Now, imagine a scenario where the insurance policy is sold with a wearable, which actually tracks the parameters continuously, feeds that data to the insurance company's server, and there is an algorithm which actually monitor, which kind of changes the premium month to month, depending on the compliance. So I mean, it reduces the risk of the insurance company. It gives an incentive for the guy who is complying properly, and it also gives a wake-up call for the guy who is not complying properly. So it's a complete win-win situation. So I see compliance-based insurance premia coming in, and that's the kind of business model which will have to be tweaked a little in other spaces of healthcare as well. So that's where I see things heading.
Most definitely. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned this, because this is actually a recurring concept and model also in terms of diabetes and NCDs very often in non-communicable diseases and chronic diseases. I believe the model actually currently does work also in Africa, surprisingly. It was supported by Bill Melinda Gates Foundation as well, where initially the insurance insured individuals on the basis of how well they control their diabetes. Of course, at the time, they haven't been using variables, but adding the variables aspect to this equation could really greatly modify the way we're handling and dealing with healthcare, particularly in emerging economies, as all of you rightly mentioned, where there's no healthcare or centralized system necessarily to help support the individual. A lot of it is privately taken care of. So is there anything you'd like to add to that question as well?
Well, quickly, I think I'm not sure why my mic.
Can't hear.
We can hear you. We should be able to hear you. So can you unmute your mic?
I think she's on mute.
Not anymore.
I think she's on mute.
Not anymore. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You can hear me? Yes. Kaustubh, just to comment on your model, while it's thinkable for something that's behavioral monitoring, there's been a lot of concern on. Can you hear me? I see Kaustubh cannot hear me. Am I audible?
Going up and down. I think she's gone on mute.
We can hear you now, Sudha.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so Kaustubh, commenting on your proposed model for tweaking the insurance based on compliance or behavioral aspects of an individual, there's been a certain, what would I say, lack of acceptance or a certain concern in the genetic space. If one were to have a mutation that predisposes one to a certain disorder, say at the age of 50, will they start charging me a premium when I'm 20 years old? Because is that fair to do, right? So that's a question that is being asked across, and something we'll have to evolve as a social and ethical, including those aspects into the model as well. In fact, predictive tests have those concerns as well, especially in contexts of India, where it could lead to a certain kind of misuse, where the genetic context of a person in terms of what they have or what they could pass on to the next generation. So if all of these tests come under the purview of the same, then it would be challenging to address all of these issues.
That's really interesting. But then, Sudha, if I might ask, probing the same question, I feel the aspect of genetics here. But I have to wonder that genetics is a large part of the personalized is an underlying important aspect. Environment, diet, and a number of other things will play a role, but genetics can determine a great deal. So, as part of the private sector, overcome this issue without stepping on ethics. Something that we already find given time in terms of implementation.
Kirti, I'm afraid the audio is not clear.
Can I suggest lower the volume? If you reduce your audio volume. I think it makes a little difference. Can you hear me now?
You're audible, but I think your voice breaks off in between sometimes.
Okay, let me try the question again. What I'm trying to say, Sudha, is that when we look at the genetic context of personalized medicine, it is an important underlying aspect when we look at personalizing medicine. And at any given time, like you rightly pointed out, genetics can be a very important aspect for ethics as well, for breach of ethics in many cases. So how do you envisage we can ever implement something like personalized medicine in a country like India if genetics is going to be an ongoing point of debate? Or I mean, I understand, of course, there's no one answer to it, but where do you think is one loophole or one way around it potentially?
So last part of your question, but my quick comment is there are two aspects to genetic testing. One is diagnostics, which is after the disease has manifested itself, right? You either have cancer or you have kind of genetic disorder. You're trying to get precise diagnostics for the patient management. There's another space which is predictive testing. So if I know my family member has been affected by cancer, a risk of getting it. Right. And if I do, then what is the insurance I need to pay? If I know I carry a mutation that could, I might end up with cancer in 20 years from now. Mm-hmm. So they're two different things. Okay. And treatment, personalized therapies are different from predictive tests. So what I was referring to is, how do we handle the outcomes of a predictive test with respect to insurance? And that is still a question that is open.
I think in this question will remain start considering the regulation. But within our I should imagine that you are right. I think a great deal more impetus needs to go into diagnostic genetic testing as opposed to predictive from the point of view of changing models initially. When it comes to insurances, I think that this is always going to be a sticky point and something of a great skepticism when it comes to dealing with private insurers in particular, possibly even employees eventually. So when you do have these employee wellness systems in place these days, practically every urban young individual these days is taking care of through their employee wellness packages. If a genetic test was added to this mix, I think it could also lead to a lot of confusion and problems potentially. Or rather, I should say, just conflicts possibly. But we have a little idea, at least, of what all of you believe could be one way or another of implementing some of these new technologies and the newer systems in terms of both regulation, in terms of also diagnosis and better care for individuals. I'm now curious to sort of ask. There's something that's come up recently from Novartis, I should actually say, where they've published that a great deal more of the lower and medium income nations are likely to suffer something in the lines of $7 trillion worth of losses in healthcare as a result of chronic NCDs, as a result of chronic non-communicable diseases alone. And to some extent, we need to find out whether the flaw is just in the aging population and the increasing urbanization. But ultimately, if this is a problem that we are looking to face in the near future in countries like India and Brazil, which traditionally are young countries looking to age and have more healthcare issues as they grow, my question to you now is that how would you, if you were given the responsibility to take care of or to arrange the healthcare system of a country like India or Brazil, and you had access to all conceivable resources, what would your strategy be? Would you be looking to put together something like a socially supported healthcare system, like the National Health Services of the UK, or would you focus entirely on the privately funded ongoing systems, or would there be integrative diagnostics, as you've already alluded to, and at least some of you have in your discussions, focusing more on preventative medicine as opposed to possibly in predictive medicine, as opposed to reactive medicine? Now, this is in the context of your NCDs and lifestyle diseases primarily. If I might ask Nick to begin with that, please.
Probably one that we can spend days on discussing. But I mean, I think even Sudha had mentioned this. I mean, to me, healthcare in general is about opportunity and access. So anybody has to have access to some form of education or care, and without the access, then it's not going to help anyone. So I think, yeah, it's really, and I'm an American, having lived in Sweden, Switzerland, and a little bit in Japan, so I've seen actually the healthcare in these different countries. And there's, of course, always advantages and disadvantages in both, like kind of a socialist type of healthcare system, such as in Sweden, and private insurance companies like in Switzerland and the US. I think usually, I mean, at least from my perspective, it has to be a combination probably. And of course, getting to the children early, it seems to be something, it should be a focus. I mean, if we don't educate and implement kind of a process or a thought process into the children, that could be more preventative than trying to attack somebody who's already 40, 50, 60 years old. So kind of focusing on the younger population, right, using types of media that this population uses for education is really important. I think it's also one kind of interesting thought is about rural medicine versus cities, because that's India and other countries, you guys, how are you going to scale the system from millions of people to 1 billion people? That's also quite a challenge. And I think not only the scaling, but the access to that for rural people. And I think, not to talk too much about Roche, but they had something called Transnet. They've been working with a company called Transnet. And this was mostly in Africa, but this was essentially having trains that go around to more rural communities and provide healthcare, whether it be education, screening, diabetes prevention, access to medicine, and especially a focus on screening and diabetes prevention. I think especially for rural type of medicine, it looks like a very good, it's basically a hospital on tracks. So a system that's a combination of both private and government, a system that focuses on early prevention with educating the children. I think these are at least some thoughts, and everyone has to think about how we scale something that's done in the millions of people to a billion of people. That's going to be a really challenge. So.
That's all very excellent points. Mobile medicines, as you rightly pointed out, happen to exist also in India currently when it comes to screening and improving finding the risk of diabetes or other complications. Who are otherwise in very inaccessible regions. I can now have Sudha. If you have any other added comments to your model for the future of India's healthcare.
I think chronic diseases like cardiovascular diseases, while one would have predisposition, are more lifestyle diseases, an outcome of how we eat and live. And in that context, things like wearable devices will be very important in managing this at a massive scale. I think even the much spoken about hub and spoke model, which has been very successful in India, where you have primary healthcare centers, secondary and tertiary, and the primary ones addressing a larger mass locally, will be a very, very important model to continue implementing in the Indian context to scale it up quickly and effectively. So both of these approaches will be important. I recently read of the success of IBM Watson to be faster than an experienced clinician in diagnosing the patient given the clinical parameters. Perhaps a few IBM Watsons in India will address a few thousand patients at a time, given that a ratio of doctor to patient is one of the lowest in the world. So we would have to complement multiple approaches to addressing this scale and need.
That's very interesting as well. Thank you for your comment. Of course, if I can bring up.
Yeah. My thought is that it has to be government as well as private funding. A very high level thought in sense it needs a lot of resolution and a lot of in-depth thinking to get it implemented. I'll just if I can share the screen, I'll try. If not, I'll just talk about it. Is the screen shared? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, that these remote kind of wearable remote diagnostic services through wearables, etc. The kiosk model that I talked about. That way, we can collect a lot of data and that link it with the Aadhaar card system that is coming up in India big time, and that will form the data pipeline for all the parameters, which will be obviously owned by the government. On top of that will sit the algorithm creators who will slice the data, dice the data, kind of artificial intelligence kind of stuff, which will obviously be the private players involved, private funding will be there. And the users of this data will be the healthcare companies, obviously, again, from the private space. So this is the kind of, this is a kind of model that I feel it's going to unfold. The business model for the government is going to be monetizing that data. That data is going to be the currency. Today, the way the government sells this telecom circles, that is, they sell the airwaves. Similarly, data could be sold to these healthcare companies, which could buy out that data and use that data for actually providing healthcare services. That's the kind of thing that I see coming up, and we should be kind of developing that kind of a model. And this JAM, that is JAM, what the government is planning, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile, that platform which the government is promoting very, very much these days. That could be capitalized, where once again, I repeat that data pipeline is owned by the government. On top of it sit the algorithm creators, that's the private people, and on top of that is the healthcare companies. So the algorithm creators and the healthcare fellows are private fellows. So that's a hybrid model that I feel will evolve.
Would you say
take time?
Hybrid model is in action somewhere at the moment? Would you say this is something that's actually being tried at a different scale elsewhere, or do you think that there's any states that have taken this on so far in India as well?
I don't see that happening, because everybody is talking about that Aadhaar platform for financial inclusion, but it has a lot of potential for these kinds of applications as well. And I'm sure the high-level thought must be there. There must be challenges in implementing, because we are a huge country, and getting everybody moving in the same direction. You've been seeing in the last 3 weeks with this demonetization drive. Though the right thing being done, but execution hassles, execution glitches do come up. So it's going to take a long time, but at a broad level, I think that's the model that should evolve in the long run. Yeah.
That's definitely interesting. Can I just go back to both Sudha and Nick to have your comments on this as well, particularly because if you're looking at the government possibly having access to the data pipeline and monetizing it together with private players, do you envisage ethics being an issue, or is this the sort of scale? Of course, a lot of these things tend to be anonymized and there's no identifiable data, but do you sense that there might be issues around that as well based on your experiences so far? If I might first ask Nick, please.
Me first. Oh, it should be ladies first, but I'll go first. I think Scandinavia is quite a good example of this. I think you guys can look more into how the system works in places like Sweden and Denmark, where they have these kind of longitudinal databases. It could be of genetics, it could be of prevalence of disease. I think this could be, I'm not 100% familiar with it, but access to samples, whether it be CSF samples or following disease, a lot of twin registries. I think I haven't heard of issues regarding, confidentiality in these types of databases, but most investigators, you have access to this data, and you can try to basically do some data mining off these registries. Yeah, they're usually de-itemized. You don't know necessarily who the patient is, but I think it's a good example for people to look into, especially this Scandinavian longitudinal assessments. And I think they've had quite successful publications and learnings from this type of registry, so in Scandinavia. So.
Most definitely. Thank you. Excellent point. Sudha, your comments on the same, please.
So one thing I would see is that the success of this will depend also on improvements in infrastructure in India. Kaustubh, I'm not sure you agree with me. A lot of this is going to be data intensive, and it requires that there is connectivity to the last mile. And that's when it will be effective. But if that happens, I think that's the best way to go forward. These questions on ethical concerns will remain, but I think the need of the hour is a think tank that thinks through these problems ahead of time and comes up with a structure that is gradual rather than something that's dramatic, because that's when typically the outcomes are not great. When there is acceptance, gradual acceptance of things, then it usually incorporates into the structure very nicely.
Excellent. Thank you for that point.
UID initiative, which started, I think, about 10 years back. The government seems to have grappled it over the last 8 to 10 years. Of course, last mile problems are always there and they will exist. But as a long term, I think that's the broad framework that should be followed. That's my view.
Okay, I think we have a very interesting. Frameworks that we can look to. The recurring themes here tend to be connectivity access, education, and ultimately support from the government and the private sector in a hybrid format. So that's really interesting to hear from all of you. But of course, we can't really talk about these innovations without first addressing, or at some level also addressing, the potential pitfalls. And it is traditionally understood that most innovations will have 5 major gaps when it comes to performance, infrastructure, sustainability, regulation, and or even preference of the end user. So where do you think, in your experience of the market of the Indian context, of course, but also generally of the emerging markets, where are we likely to face some of the biggest challenges in terms of these pitfalls and these gaps? If I might begin this question now with Sudha, please.
So, yes, in innovation, I think is the question I hear from you. Your voice is breaking, so I'm just reading between the lines. I would think the primary limiting context would be infrastructure. And much of it has, I think it has been shouldered by the private entities to overcome for many of these things. And in fact, it has also been an opportunity for innovation on the other side, where if there is no access to some innovates on a model that can be reaching the patient quickly and without the need for big infrastructure. I think for example, there was this model where for childbirth, for tracking the contractions, there was this very simple device that was made that could go from village to village. If a mother is in labor, it did not require that the patient reach the hospital for childbirth. So when there is lack of infrastructure, it also kind of innovation. So which is both good and bad, but I think we still have long ways to go on infrastructure. And second, of course, on the performance, I must say from the Indian context, we've done fairly well on maximizing returns from existing technologies because of the need itself. We're great at providing services, improving processes and protocols. That's been a significant advantage. Sustainability will depend quite a bit on the government, its support on how this can be implemented across and made sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Regulations, not great in the Indian context from a healthcare perspective, at least in the diagnostic space, we have long ways to go. We don't have a mechanism like it is there in the developed world, and needs to be worked upon. So I think from a rating perspective, I would put infrastructure as one of the biggest gaps in the Indian context.
That's very interesting. Thank you. That's very interesting. I think you are regulations.
Regulations.
If you'd like to that question as well.
If you'd like to question as well.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there's always gaps. 5 seems minimal, but focus on these. I mean, I think in terms of performance, it's always validation and reproducibility. So with any test, no matter what it is, I mean, how reproducible is these outcomes and how reproducible is the measure? I think this is really under-validated, actually. People do not really look enough into the performance. I think even like, what is it, Theranos now that has major problems. I mean, so it's, you know, as accurate, we need to be accurate, because anytime you go to implement something such a large scale, you know, it could be then a very big waste of money if it's not as validated and reproducible as everyone hopes it to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's Sudha and others have already mentioned quite a lot about access. No matter what it is, it's always going to be, again, the scalability and providing the access to people.
Mm-hmm.
I think these are the main things. And of course, it also always comes down to cost. And I think whatever it is, whether it's a diagnostic test or it's a drug, I mean, it has to be, people have to be able to afford it. So governments have to be able to afford it. Obviously, the patient has to be able to afford it. I think cost is always a gap. So.
Wonderful, thank you. Kaustubh, your comments, please, on this.
I agree with Sudha when she says about infrastructure is going to be the biggest challenge Digital connectivity is going to be the biggest challenge. But what happens is, because we have these constraints, a lot of innovators push themselves hard and get over it. A great example is, which bank would you believe in India has the maximum internet penetration? Normal names would come ICICI or maybe an Axis Bank or a Kotak Bank, but no, it's SBI, State Bank of India, the old fuddy-duddy that we call them. But they have figured out a technology which doesn't need smartphones to access your internet banking. A simple Java-enabled phone, the basic Nokia phones that people used to use 10 years back, you can do internet banking using that Java-enabled phone if you have an SBI account. So that's how people will, the robust and the tough hostile conditions in emerging economies, developing countries, push innovators also. Plus, cost also. What happens in a country like ours is, say a country which is distributed over a population of maybe 50 or 60 million. Here in India, that same infrastructure spreads over 500 or 600 million. So cost per capita also comes down. So it's about taking that first step. There is going to be a lot of teething trouble, but yes, there has to be government sustainable support all through. Private enterprises will obviously look at the long-term returns and they will stick with it. So I don't see it's a cat and mouse game. It's going to take time, but yes, it is going to take time. But yeah, I mean, that's my view.
I think, again, we have a very unanimous idea around the potential gaps. It seems that access...
Yeah, one more thing. I feel my personal view is the Indian Supreme Court is becoming a little too active in terms of, not letting some things getting legislated and things like that. For example, again, coming back to this Aadhaar identification, the previous government as well as this government has been very keen that every single Indian gets an Aadhaar card, and it kind of becomes compulsory in the long run. But I think this activism of the Supreme Court is somewhere hampering this UID attempt of the government. That's my view. So over-activism from the judiciary also is not good for penetration of, or development or whatever you call it.
Certainly, there's always a balance, I suppose, and thank you for that comment as well. But again, broadly speaking, just a moment, I think Sudha has a comment.
Yes, just to that the only country that is more populous than us is China, and it's a communist country, so they can just implement laws like that, and it would be very tough in a democracy like this, 1.6 billion views of everything.
Nevertheless, I think we are on the right path. I think somewhere between the initiatives of Digital India and the very many attempts also on part of the government with the Aadhaar card and what else, everything else in between, plus the ingenuity of the upcoming entrepreneurs and startups and disruptive technologies that are currently thriving in India, I think that there might be hope that we have got in our hands, hopefully, a very novel new model to look into in the coming years. We are actually already running over time, but we have one question from a viewer, which I find rather interesting. I'd love to have all three of you attempt it, or if one of you in particular would like to address this. We have a question from Dr. Sean Brown in Aberdeen, Dundee, who'd like to know what are the implications possibly of contraceptives and birth control in countries, emerging economies, and how will that pan out or play out potentially in healthcare modeling in the near future? Any takers? Do we have any of you? Would you like to address that question?
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, should healthcare also account for birth control and for contraception in emerging economies in order to better control for certain health conditions?
Anybody wanting to take it? Yeah, I think more higher educational levels, higher awareness levels is going to take care of that. We are not a communist country, so we can't enforce contraception or a single child policy the way China can do. We are a much more liberal country, and it has to be tackled through education. That's my view.
Excellent. Okay. On that note, I think I'd just like to thank all of the speakers today then for your time and some very interesting insights. I think we have a lot to take from this in order to move forwards and do our own little parts in the various fields that we're working in. So once again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all for joining us.
We'll be in touch again very soon with more comments from
Here's the state.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Kirti.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.